Hello, Janeites, dancers, and tea enthusiasts. Welcome to Tea with Cassie and E. I'm Cassie and E Mobley, and this video is for Virtual JaneCon 2025. Our subject is The Dancing Life of Miss Jane Austen, or What Would Jane Dance? I'm delighted to be back at JaneCon this year and delighted to be involved with 3 different videos. So if you enjoy my work, please check out the other 2 videos that I'm doing for JaneCon this year. They're both very silly and adorable, in my own opinion. And they're with my bestie, Mary Hill. One of them is called Queer Jane Austen Fantasy Sports Ball, in which we basically rate queer Austen shipping, and then we play fantasy sports ball with it. It's pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. Our other one is a deep dive into the film Austenland. So if you've ever been curious about that movie, or you just want to see a couple of nerds nerding out about one of their favorite movies, please check that out. So our subject for today is The Dancing Life of Miss Jane Austen, or What Would Jane Dance? I'm primarily using 3 sources for this video. The first one is Jane Austen's letters, edited by Deirdre, Faye, 4th edition. And to go with that and to give context with it, I am also using Jane Austen, A Family Record, also edited by Deirdre Faye. It really helped me give some context to some of the things Jane was talking about in her letters, and therefore I was better able to analyze her dance life. And the third source I am using is Dances from Jane Austen's Assembly Room by Allison Thompson. I'm going to be using this towards the end of the video to talk about the dances that have been found in Jane Austen's music books. So most of this is going to be me combing through Jane's letters for references on dancing to see if I can answer the question, what would Jane dance? And then at the very end, we're going to take a look at some of the music from her personal collection and see if that tells us anything about her preferences. And without further ado, let's dive into Jane Austen's letters. In the very first letter in the collection, Jane compares some low-key flirting she observed at a recent ball to the absolutely over-the-top flirting she was doing with Tom Lefroy. In a letter dated 9th and 10th of January 1796 to her sister Cassandra, Jane writes, "Mr. H. with Elizabeth and afterwards danced with her again, but they do not know how to be particular. I flatter myself, however, that they will profit by 3 successive lessons which I have given them. You scold me so much in the nice long letter which I have this moment received from you, that I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together." I just love the self-conscious snark of Jane being like, yeah, these 2 people, they were flirting, but they're amateurs compared to me. Girl, I'll just let you imagine how much Tom and I scandalize people with all of our dancing and hanging out together. The next time she mentions dancing is a letter dated 5th of September, 1796. "We were at a ball on Saturday, I assure you. We dined at Goodstone in the evening and danced 2 country dances and the Boulangers. I opened the ball with Edward Bridges, and the other couples were Louis Cage and Harriet, Frank and Louisa, Fanny and George. Elizabeth played 1 country dance, Lady Bridges the other, which she made Henry dance with her, and Miss Finch played the Boulanger. On reading over that last 3 or 4 lines, I am aware of my having exposed myself in so doubtful a manner that if I did not tell you the contrary, you might imagine that it was Lady Bridges who made Henry dance with her at the same time she was playing, which, if not impossible, must appear to be a very improbable event to you, but it was Elizabeth who danced." Even though Jane refers to this as a ball, it's pretty clear that this was a small, informal affair that took place at a dinner party. There were only 4 couples and only 3 dances total, and the older ladies took turns playing so that everyone would get a chance to dance. Jane says she opened the ball, which means both that she got to start at the top of the set and that she got to select the tune and the figures for the dance. Her use of the word ball here is interesting because it's different than our modern notion of a ball. We tend to think of a ball as a formal party given for the primary purpose of dancing, but here the dancing is clearly just one of several activities at a dinner party. This is not the only time that Jane Austen described such an informal dance setting as a ball, however, because in Mansfield Park, she also described Fanny Price's partaking in an informal dance at a dinner party as her first ball. I also just love that Jane uses some ambiguous syntax when describing the dance, and then has to spend a lot more ink just to clarify herself in the letter. The next mention of dancing comes from the 17th and 18th of November, 1798. There is to be a ball at Basingstoke next Thursday. Our assemblies have very kindly declined since we laid down the carriage, so that the disconvenience and the disinclination to go have kept apace. According to the footnote in this letter, Austen is referring to the fact that her family had recently been forced to give up their carriage because of how expensive it was to keep it up. Considering the expense of owning a car today, I kind of relate to this. So Austen is basically saying here that she hasn't been going to as many balls because it's now too much of a hassle to get there, but that she doesn't really mind as much as she would have otherwise because the balls have been declining in quality so much. She would have been a month shy of 23 at this time, and it seems really sad to me that a girl of 22 should be prevented from going to balls due to a lack of transportation. Even though Jane says that she doesn't feel as bad as she otherwise would, I can't help feeling that this may be just some sour grapes on her part. But we'll hear more about the declining quality of local balls in upcoming letters. Jane does give an account of that Basingstoke ball dated the following week, though it's unclear if she actually went herself or was just repeating gossip. I'm inclined to think the latter because she says nothing about the finery or who danced with whom, which is often what her descriptions of balls contain. She merely says, "The ball on Thursday was a very small one indeed. There were but 7 couples and 27 people in the room." Yeah, that's small. Very small. The next account of a ball comes from a letter written between Christmas Eve and Boxing Day of 1798. Our ball was small, but by no means unpleasant. There were but 31 people and only 11 ladies out of the number, and but 5 single women in the room. Of the gentlemen present, you may have some idea from the list of my partners: Mr. Wood, G. Lefroy, Rice, Mr. Butcher, Mr. William Ord, Mr. John Harwood, and Mr. Calland, who appeared, as usual, with his hat in hand, and stood every now and then behind Catherine and me to be talked at and abused for not dancing. There were 20 dancers, and I danced them all, and without any fatigue. I was glad to find myself capable of dancing so much, and with so much satisfaction as I did. From my slender enjoyment of the Ashford balls as assemblies for dancing, I had not thought myself equal to it. But in cold weather, and with few couples, I fancy I could just as well dance for a week together as for half an hour. I love this description because there's just so much to unpack. So the fact that there were so few ladies at the ball means that Jane would have been in high demand as a dance partner, and indeed, she says she danced all 20 dances. I have to say that 20 dances in a single evening back then is highly unusual and can only be accounted for by the sparse attendance. Some of my modern English country dancers may be looking quizzically at me because 20 dances is not unusual for a modern English country dance ball. But you have to understand that because of the snowballing progression that was used at the time, meaning that only the first couple started the dance and the other dancers had to wait until the original top couple danced down to their position, and because dances were done as triple minors instead of duple minors, even if they didn't require a third couple, dances ran very long compared to how they run today. Susan de Guardiola did a very handy calculation for this. A set of just 3 couples would need to play the tune 6 times through in order for every couple to get a chance to dance down. A 4-couple set would need 12 times through the tune, and every additional couple would need an additional 4 repeats. So if you had 10 couples in your set, you would need to play the tune 12 plus 4 times 6 times for a total of 36 times the tune. If the tune is 30 seconds long, that equals 18 minutes of dancing. If the tune lasts for a full minute, that's 36 minutes of dancing. And dance sets could very frequently be much longer than that. So you can see where you didn't typically get through a ton of dances in the course of the night. But with such a small crowd, you could do comparatively more. I also love the description of Mr. Calland being a lurk and standing behind and talking to the dancers. This is something that Mr. Thorpe does in Northanger Abbey, and it was considered tacky then, especially since the conversation was supposed to be with your dance partner. That's how you get Henry Tilney's famous quote about dancing being like a marriage inasmuch as 2 people are entering into a contract for their sole mutual benefit and amusement. Which means he is likening this man talking to his partner as a form of cheating on him. As for Jane's comments on a cold evening and a sparse ballroom making it easier not to get fatigued, well, yeah, can confirm. Nothing brings on the exhaustion more than a hot, stuffy ballroom. I once went to a week-long contra dance camp during a 100-degree heat wave. That's about 40 Celsius, by the way. And it was so miserable that I had absolutely no stamina. Also, can we appreciate the shade Jane throws at the Ashford balls, particularly as assemblies for dancing? The fact that she's throwing shade on them, particularly as assemblies for dancing, means that she cared a great deal about the dancing aspect of balls and not just the socializing and the courting aspects. The next letter of note comes from the week of the 9th of January, 1799. Jane here describes a dinner and dance held by a Mrs. Bramston. There were more dancers than the room could conveniently hold, which is enough to constitute a good ball any time. I do not think I was very much in request. People were rather apt not to ask me until they could not help it. One's consequence, you know, varies so much at times without any particular reason. There was one gentleman, an officer in the Cheshire, a very good-looking young man, who I was told very much wanted to be introduced to me, but as he did not want it quite so much as to take the trouble of affecting it, we never could bring it about. I danced with Mr. John Wood again, twice with a Mr. South, with G. Lefroy and J. Harwood, who I think takes to me rather more than he used to. One of my gayest actions was sitting down for 2 dancers in preference to having Lord Bolton's eldest son for my partner, who danced too ill to be endured. I find it really interesting that while in the last letter, Jane noted that a fairly small and empty ballroom enabled her to dance every dance without fatigue, in this case, she says having more dancers than the space can hold is the sign of a good ball. Clearly, dancing comfortably is a secondary or even tertiary consideration by that metric. You can tell Jane feels a little slighted for not being the top choice of partners for the gentleman that evening, and I really love that she turns down the eldest son of the local lord because his dancing is just so bad. By the etiquette of that time, turning down someone for a dance meant that you had to sit out the whole dance and couldn't dance with anyone else. So that's quite the sacrifice on Jane's part. He must have been a really awful dancer. The next dance record of note comes from the 1st of November, 1800. Jane writes, "It was a pleasant ball, and still more good than pleasant, for there were nearly 60 people, and sometimes we had 17 couple. There was a scarcity of men in general, and still a greater scarcity of any that were good for much. I danced 9 dances out of 10, 5 with Stephen Terry, T. Shute, and James Digweed, and 4 with Catherine. There was commonly a couple of ladies standing up together, but not often any so amiable as ourselves." This last sentence gives you an idea of just how rare same-gendered dancing was, that Jane thought it was notable that there was one same-gender couple in almost every dance due to the scarcity of men. I love how much Jane leans into it and talks about what an amiable couple she and her friend Catherine made. It's also telling that at this point in Jane's life, she's used to rural balls in which 17 couples constitutes a good turnout. Balls in places like London and Bath could have over 100 couples there, as we will see in later letters. Interestingly, though, while 60 people made for a good turnout to Jane in the last letter, in the next letter she describes a ball with a turnout of 50, and she seems less pleased. This is from the letter dated 20th and 21st of November, 1800. "There were only 12 dances, of which I danced 9, and was merely prevented from dancing the rest by want of a partner. We began at 10, supped at 1, and were in Dean before 5. There were but 50 people in the room, very few families indeed from our side of the country, and not many more from the other. My partners were the 2 St. John's, Hooper Holder, and very prodigious, Mr. Matthew, with whom I called the last, and whom I liked the best of my little stock." It shows just how used Jane was to having small dance sets at this point that she complains of having only 12 dances. From an aggregate of the balls in the period that I've read about, 8 to 10 for the whole evening seems to have been the average, and I think most people would have been delighted to have 12 dances in the evening. But Jane seems to think that unusually few. Jane got to call the last dance of the evening, which meant that she got to choose the tune and the figures that were danced, an honor that ladies clamored for back then. And there were various ways of determining who would get to do this described in rules for different assemblies. which I've described in other videos. There's no mention of what method was being used to decide in this case. On the 3rd through 5th of January 1801, Jane makes this quick comment about her family's upcoming move to Bath. I get more and more reconciled to the idea of our removal. We have lived long enough in this neighbourhood, and the Basingstoke balls are certainly on the decline, and there is something interesting in the bustle of going away. Basingstoke is the nearest town to where the Austens were living in the village of Steventon, just like the Bennet sisters in Pride and Prejudice lived in the village of Longbourn but had to go to the nearest town for their assembly balls, which in their case was Meryton. The notion that the Basingstoke balls were on the decline certainly is consistent with Jane's constant complaints about the smallness of the balls and her lack of partners. The next description of a ball comes from a letter dated 12th and 13th of May, 1801, from Bath, where the Austen family had recently moved. In the evening, I hope you honoured my toilet and ball with a thought. I dressed myself as well as I could, and had my finery much admired at home. By 9 o'clock, my uncle and aunt and I entered the rooms, and linked Miss Winston on to us. Before tea, it was a rather dull affair, but did not last long, for there were only one dance, danced by 4 couple. Think of 4 couples surrounded by 100 people dancing in the upper rooms at Bath. After tea, we cheered up. The breaking up of private parties sent some scores more to the ball, and though it was shockingly and inhumanly thin for the place, there were people enough, I suppose, to make 5 or 6 very pretty Basingstoke assemblies. This is one of those passages that I'm very grateful to have the book Jane Austen, A Family Record for context. Apparently, this was the penultimate ball of the season in Bath, which explains the small turnout, because a lot of people had already left for the summer. Also, based on those attendance numbers, wow, talk about some culture shock for Jane. A poor turnout in Bath was enough to fill 5 or 6 Basingstoke balls. There are very few letters and no descriptions of dancing between 1801 and 1804. We know from the family records that the Austens spent about half the year in Bath and the other half traveling to the seaside or visiting relatives. The next mention of a ball comes from a letter written at Lyme Regis in September of 1804. The ball last night was pleasant, but not full for a Thursday. My father stayed very contentedly till 9:30. We went a little after 8 and then walked home with James. My mother and I stayed about an hour later. Nobody asked me the first 2 dances. The 2 second I danced with Mr. Crawford, and had I chosen to stay longer, might have danced with Mr. Granville, Mrs. Granville's son, whom my dear friend Miss Armstrong offered to introduce me, or with a new, odd-looking man who had been eyeing me for some time and at last, without any introduction, asked me if I meant to dance again. I think he must be Irish by his ease. There are 2 things that interest me about this account. The first is that Jane didn't stay very long, possibly owing to her elderly parents being present, but it's really hard to tell from the context. It might also be because Jane was starting to age out of dancing at balls. That was really considered to be an activity for the very young adults, especially people who were looking to get married. And at this point, Jane was almost 29 and not actively looking to get married, so she wouldn't have been considered as eligible a dance partner as she used to be. Women were generally expected to give up dancing sometime in their 30s, regardless of marital status, so Jane would have been one of the older women looking for partners. Add to that she was also in a seaside town on a long holiday rather than a place where she had an extensive acquaintance, and you can understand why she had trouble finding someone to dance with. Another thing that strikes me is Jane being accosted and asked to dance by someone whom she hadn't been introduced to, which, while not forbidden, would have been considered a fairly serious breach of etiquette, and Jane can only account for this by saying the person must have been Irish. From there, Jane doesn't mention dancing again until November of 1808, when she was living in Southampton with her mother and sister at her brother Frank's house. A little context for this is that while Mrs. Austen and her daughters were living in Southampton at this point, they had just made arrangements to move to a house in Chawton within the next few months. So Jane is writing this letter while her mind is very much occupied with the idea that she won't be in Southampton much longer. A larger circle of acquaintance and an increase in amusements is quite in character with our approaching removal. Yes, I mean to go to as many balls as possible that I might have a good bargain. Our ball was rather more amusing than I expected. The room was tolerably full, and there were perhaps 30 couple of dancers. The melancholy part was to see so many dozen young women standing without partners, and each of them with 2 ugly naked shoulders. There were only 4 dances, and it went to my heart to see the Miss Lances, one of whom two named Emma, should have had partners for only two. You will not expect to hear that I was asked to dance, but I was, by the gentleman whom we met that Sunday with Captain d'Auvergne. We have always kept up a bowing acquaintance since, and being pleased with his black eyes, I spoke to him at the ball, which brought on this civility. The first thing I need to comment on is the set size, and the fact that there were only 4 dances the whole night. That makes me believe that it was one long set of 30 couples. Using Susan de Guardiola's formula, that means that they would have had to play the dance 116 times. If we calculate 30 seconds for once through the tune, that leaves us with a runtime of 58 minutes, so basically an hour per dance. If the tune was a minute long, then we're talking almost 2 hours for a single dance. That's why there were only 4 all night. What Jane means about going to as many balls as possible to have a good bargain is that she was going to assembly balls, which usually required you to buy a subscription for the whole season. Sort of like buying a season pass for a theme park or season tickets to a local theater. So in order to get the most of the money she paid for the subscription, Jane wants to go to as many balls as possible before her family moves away. It also seems as if Jane saw this as the last hurrah for her dancing days. She would have been about to turn 33 at this point, and would have been expected to give up dancing very soon. A move to the country, therefore, where there would be a lot less opportunities for dancing, would have seemed like an excellent time to call it quits. When she speaks about plans for the future, they involve facilitating dances for others rather than for herself. Writing to Cassandra in January of 1809, she says, yes, we will have a pianoforte, as good a one as can be got for 30 guineas. And I will practice country dances that we may have some amusement for our nieces and nephews. But it seems that she wasn't quite done dancing and flirting yet, because she says in a letter to Cassandra written on the 17th and 18th of January 1809, the Queen's birthday moved the assembly to this night instead of the last. I propose on being asked to dance by our acquaintance Mr. Smith, now Captain Smith, who has lately reappeared in Southampton, but I shall decline. Even as a confirmed spinster, Jane can still have some fun joking about spurning suitors, and she follows up about this in her next letter. Your silence on the subject of our ball makes me suppose your curiosity too great for words. The room was tolerably full, and the ball opened by Miss Glynn. The Miss Lances had partners, Captain d'Auvergne's friend appeared in regimentals, Caroline Maitland had an officer to flirt with, and Mr. John Harrison was deputed by Captain Smith, being himself absent, to ask me to dance. So her flirtation didn't go as planned, but she still ended up with a dance partner. I also think it's worth noting that even though she doesn't make much mention of her own dancing, she still is paying attention to the social aspects, like which lady opened the ball and which ladies had trouble finding partners. It's very much the same keen eye to attention that she brings to descriptions of ballrooms in her novels. Unfortunately, that was the last reference I can find to Jane herself dancing. We do know that she made good on her promise to play country dances for her nibblings, because her niece Fanny Knight recorded one such occasion in her diary in April of 1812, and in February of 1817, Jane wrote to Fanny about having received sheet music for quadrilles from her. Much obliged for the quadrilles, which I am grown to think pretty enough, though of course they are very inferior to the cotillions of my own day. I think there may be 2 separate jokes going on in this passage. Jane seems to be making fun of the human inclination of older people to think things were better back in their day, but she also may be commenting on the fact that the first set quadrille, also known as the French quadrille, was actually composed of the figures of several cotillions that had been popular in Jane Austen's day, including Latte, which I learned from one of Susan de Guardiola's lectures during the pandemic, was republished many, many times in the few decades previous to the publication of the quadrille. And that's the end of dancing in Jane's own words. But we're not quite done yet, because I still want to talk a little bit about the dance tunes that were found in Jane Austen's music books. Remember how she wrote that she intended to play country dances for her nibblings' amusement, and her niece Fanny recorded that she followed through on that? Well, there are several surviving manuscripts of dance tunes she wrote down. So I had a look at a selection of them that Allison Thompson published in Dances from Jane Austen's Assembly Rooms, and saw how far I could trace them. In order to research the history of these dances, I relied heavily on the very excellent research papers by Paul Cooper on regencydances.org, as well as the traditional tune archive, which is an open source wiki and, like most wikis, is not as thorough as I would like it to be. I found the history for almost all the tunes, and by and large, they show that Aunt Jane was keeping up with the fashionable tunes of the day. Many of the tunes, like Waterloo, were written well after she stopped dancing. Some were about a decade old but continued to be popular, like the Fairy Dance and Lady Caroline Lee's Waltz. A few were from Jane's youth but still popular, and some were old Scottish and Irish tunes that had come back into fashion and stayed in fashion, like Drops of Brandy and My Love, She's But a Lassie Yet. But overall, it paints a picture of a hip aunt who's keeping up with the latest trends for her family. You go, Jane. So, to sum everything up, Jane Austen in her youth seems to have been someone who enjoyed going to balls both for the social aspect of the activity and also for the dancing itself. Yes, she liked to flirt and to keep up with all the gossip, but she also cared enough about the quality of the dancing that she was distressed when there weren't enough dancers, and she wasn't above snubbing the son of a lord if he was a bad dancer. She danced from her teens until she was in her early 30s, when she would have been considered too old for dancing and expected to give it up. And then she took up playing dance music for her younger relatives and made sure to keep current on popular dances. I've always heard that Jane Austen loved to dance. The way she writes about it in her novels was evidence enough to me of that, but now that I've gone over her letters and her music collection, it seems all but confirmed. So, what would Jane dance? Well, yes, country dances, obviously. But now we can also say that she danced well, with fashionable taste, and if the selection from her music books is any indication, with a strong inclination for Irish and Scottish tunes. Thank you so much for watching this. If you enjoyed this video, please check out the rest of the videos for Virtual JaneCon this year, and as I said earlier, 2 of them are also on this channel. Please like and subscribe for more Regency Dance content. And if you're lucky, I may post some whimsical videos on other topics. Thank you so much for watching, and again, as always, have an ostentatiously good day.